Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Burçin. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law, and I'm very excited to welcome you to this webinar. Institute for Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan academic think tank dedicated to improving the quality of governmental decision-making. We use economics and law to support smart policies for the environment, public health, and consumers. This webinar is part of a series highlighting environmental and energy research projects funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Our goal in these conversations is to highlight interdisciplinary research on energy and environment and bridge the gap with cutting edge amazing research and real-life policymakers. With that goal in mind, each of these webinars feature research supported by the Sloan Foundation as well as policy experts working on a daily basis. Today, we will be talking about energy equity, not just about energy access and use, but different dimensions of equity and energy transition. We know that energy transition is an economy-wide endeavor, and it will have wide varying impacts on energy use, energy access, energy prices, as well as job implications. So we will hear from researchers on their ongoing projects in this area and their initial findings. We will also hear from New York State Department of Environmental Conservation about very real questions they're facing as they work to implement New York's ambitious climate law. We have a packed agenda, so I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers. First, Dr. Jonathan Colmer, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Virginia and the co-founder and director of the Environmental Inequality Lab. His research combines data with insights from economic theory and environmental science to better understand how economic activity and the environment influence one another. We have Anissa Rodriguez-Dickerman, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Pecan Street, Inc., where she leads resource and partnership development, guides strategy, and ensures the delivery of programs that achieve measurable results in climate and conservation. Dr. Dickerman has extensive leadership experience applying big data analytics to policy and systems in the education field. Then we have Dr. Diana Hernandez, who is an associate professor of sociomedical sciences at Columbia University, where she conducts research at the intersection of energy equity, housing, and health. A sociologist by training, her work examines the social and environmental determinants of health and has studied the impacts of policy and place-based interventions on the health and well-being of socioeconomically disadvantaged populations. Then we have Dr. Benjamin Sokol, who is the director of the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability and the professor in the Department of Earth and Environment. He works as a researcher and consultant on issues pertaining to global energy policy and politics, energy security, energy justice, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. Finally, we will hear from John Binder, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Climate Change, Air Resources, and Energy at New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He is responsible for the development and execution of a wide range of efforts to reduce air pollutant emissions and help achieve the state's climate and energy policies. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of our panelists. We have a packed agenda, so let's dive in with our first panelist, Anissa Rodriguez-Dickerman.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. And I'm really excited to share about one of our hallmark projects that is funded by the Sloan Foundation. So I'm Anissa Rodriguez-Dickerman, and I'm the CEO of Pecan Street. I lead the organization, and we are a 501 nonprofit organization that launched in Austin, Texas in 2009. We established the first energy research network of real customers using behind the meter sensors that measure electricity from multiple circuits 24 hours a day. So we collect second level data. Over the past few years, our organization has really evolved into a world-class research organization. We help to accelerate the transition to clean and just energy by expanding our national test bed of participants. And we've developed other expertise in data-focused climate needs, including water and soil carbon research as well. We have a database of customer energy generation and use data. It is the most comprehensive and robust of its kind on the planet. There are more than 600 peer-reviewed papers that have used data from our data port, from Pecan Street's data port, and have been published on issues around climate change, on electric system and grid reliability, transportation, electrification, and urban resilience as well. We have a Center for Race, Energy, and Climate Justice that focuses on advancing a just climate transition. So through critical and generous support from the Sloan Foundation, Pecan Street is engaged in a 3-year project with university and local community-based organization partners, and we're expanding our household energy research network to 4 new regions that are focused on equitable energy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who those 4 partners are and the work that we're engaged with there. This will allow us to expand to more than 200 homes that are in traditionally underserved communities. We're going to be equipping the homes that are a part of these regions in this partnership with Pecan Street's energy research equipment and addressing a critical data gap for low-income communities and households of color. These 4 new geographies are Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Central Pennsylvania, Atlanta, and Portland as well. So these are our 4 partners that are part of our research network. In Atlanta, we're partnered with Georgia Tech and the Grove Park Foundation. We're going to conduct surveys and interviews there, workshops with residents of the Grove Park neighborhood, and we're collecting energy use data using that advanced sensing that I mentioned earlier. The goals of the project there are to calibrate inclusive urban building energy modeling that will help to inform different design decisions related to electrification and to eliminate energy cost burdens. So we're also hoping to increase regional energy resiliency, and that will also help to inform developing innovations that are intended to help counter some of the disproportionately adverse impacts of climate change on those urban communities. In Oklahoma City, we are partnered with the University of Oklahoma's Data Institute for Societal Challenges, or DISC, the Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis, and community-based organization Restore OKC. There, we're going to work with low to moderate income households that will help to quantify the financial as well as the energy use impacts of energy efficiency and renewable energy measures, and the impacts of things like shade tree cover on household energy burdens. So the team will engage with the community-based organization Restore OKC and their advisory team throughout the process to help ensure that our research findings will be of immediate and long-term use and also benefit to the community. In Central Pennsylvania, we're partnered with Temple University and Central Susquehanna Opportunities to help investigate energy use and energy transition perspectives and what those implications are on various energy transition policies and technologies on underserved communities specifically. The last partner in Portland, Oregon, we are partnered with Reed College, the Community Energy Project, and Kappa Strategies LLC. In that partnership, we're going to explore residents' responses to the installation of HVAC systems and increased electrification, and the grid impacts of that increased electrification and HVAC installations to the extent that the energy transition is going to help prevent heat-related deaths specifically. Some of the anticipated outcomes from these projects. So the first one is that through this novel data set generated by the 4 communities, when that is paired with our already existing residential energy research network, it will encompass a national comparative data set for novel research into equitable energy transition policies, different technologies, and adoption strategies as well. Pecan Street will make all of the data that is collected available to the community research teams as a daily updated searchable database of time-stamped historical energy data from high resolution and end-use residential data as well. The second anticipated project outcome is that we anticipate completion of the regional research programs that will help address critical intersectional questions that are central to achieving this equitable energy transition. And then the third one, we anticipate that at least 6 publications will be produced by our research teams in aggregate, with at least 1 publication produced on each regional research project, and 2 will be produced on comparative and national scale implications of the data and research programs. We anticipate that at least 750 university researchers will use the new data via our data port in their own unique research. So this project is historic. It is really an effort of utilizing all the different stakeholders in the community that need to have a voice in this equitable energy transition. It is unique in that we are partnering with not only universities, but community-based organizations and other researchers. And I think the most important part of this research is that we are trying to attend to the local context. And so the way that we partner with communities and researchers for these projects is that we've had a lot of stakeholder engagement meetings, a lot of listening sessions to really engage and design and co-create projects that are meaningful to them at the local level and that we feel will have an impact on their communities and an improved benefit of being able to utilize the data in our data port and using that to help inform this equitable energy transition. The other great part about this partnership is that these projects are highly replicable. And so the data that we're gathering through these novel data sets will allow us to replicate projects like these in other communities regionally. Pecan Street started out in Austin, Texas, but we've expanded since that time, since 2009, when we started to 10 states and to Puerto Rico as well. And so the structure of this project, I think, is something that is easily replicable and something that's sustainable in other parts of the US so that we can learn more about how communities are utilizing energy. You can think about how we can help them to move toward this clean and just energy transition. We're excited to be a part of this project and honored to be a part of this webinar today. So thank you so much. I look forward to any questions and additional conversations to come.
Thank you. I definitely look forward to that data. Great. Before I ask Benjamin to talk, a quick reminder for our audience. If you have any questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use those questions and we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Benjamin?
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. Too bad not in person, but at least online. And it's also a pleasure to talk about some of our newest work on energy and climate justice, which is something we take very seriously at the Institute. I wanted to just give you a few quick slides about the Institute, obligatory usually, because it is new and we've only been existing for about 2 years. So if you've never heard of us, we understand. Most people have not heard of us. But we are at an institute where we look at 3 different dimensions on the left. These are our research themes or umbrellas: planetary and environmental health, climate governance and sustainability transitions, and energy systems of the future. 3 huge areas that cover everything from ecosystems to communities of color to new modes of subnational action, all the way to energy on the demand side and the supply side. But every time we study those, we try to do something very special on the right. And equity and justice, I assure you, was there before today. Equity and justice was meant to be there as one of the distinctive elements of every time we do research on health or governance or energy. We really want to focus on equality, equity, empowerment, as well as how to minimize vulnerability. The second thing we really want to do is create really good data tools, whether it is original data sets or good data science techniques like machine learning or topic modeling, or good data visualizations, or good really mixed methods analysis of our data sets, which is also tending to be rare. And finally, we don't just want to opine articles from the armchairs in academia. We want to have an impact on policymaking, on cities, on corporations, and even on civil society and social movements. So that's what the Institute for Global Sustainability is. We now have 100 faculty at Boston University. So even though we're new, we've grown quite significantly. And come visit us if you're in Boston. If you want to learn more about the Institute, my wonderful comms director has put together our annual report, which you can just download here with the QR code, and you can see Climate Justice Now is in our cover as well, and our tagline is kind of advancing a more resilient and equitable future. Great. So, what are we up to? I wanted to talk about two projects, mostly the Sloan Foundation project, but firstly, we have yet to start a very relevant project. Those of you may realize there's a kind of boom expected for offshore wind energy in the United States. They have been talking about this for many decades. There have been some bad press recently about canceled projects in New York and New Jersey, but it's going ahead off the coast of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And so we were very lucky to get a Department of Energy grant where we will work with local communities who are trying to build out this offshore wind. So these are port and harbor communities that will see where the manufacturing, installation, and a lot of the assembly of those offshore wind farms happens. And we'll be designing justice metrics, whatever they may be. We're not sure what they are yet, but metrics that capture the intersectionality of justice and vulnerability across many different dimensions: economic, social, political, and cultural, to help guide the Biden-Harris administration's kind of Justice 40 goals, and also to really co-develop energy justice roadmaps with our different communities, one of which may even be close to you all in New York, with the other ones probably in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and New London, Connecticut. We're still trying to finalize our third site. And this is great because it's a 5-year project. We start in the first 2 years by co-creating those metrics. And then the final 3 years, we track the metrics. So we can literally show different dimensions of community well-being that improve or that degrade. And also, I'm expecting different elements that trade off, which is really about the political economy of justice. Usually, even when you do pro-justice interventions, there are still losers. And obviously, you want to minimize those as much as possible. So we'll help identify the losers and hopefully create win-win-win situations if they exist. And if not, reveal what's at stake. That project is really neat, even though it's only in New England. By far, another fascinating project is my Sloan Foundation grant, which is a bit obtuse. The title is there at the top: Advancing Transformational Energy Justice Across the Renewable Energy Supply Chain. Lots of buzzwords there, but transformational is really meant to deal with the mix of legacy injustices as well as new injustices that are created as we transition to low carbon technology, in this particular case, solar energy and wind energy. And then you can see across the supply chain is the other key word. And so there's kind of a bias in a lot of social acceptance work or a lot of geography work or energy policy work that looks at the site of where the technology is used. And that makes sense. My own PhD was around visiting wind farms and solar parks and hydroelectric dams, right? So you go to where the power plant is. And when you see good colleagues like James Hansen, right, protest, they're usually protesting in front of the coal-fired power plant. It's very visible. But in focusing on where these technologies are deployed at the large-scale solar park or the offshore wind farm, you often miss these different hidden parts of the supply chain, all the way upstream and downstream. All the way upstream, say, at mining and mineral extraction that are needed to help propel low-carbon innovations, things like copper, tellurium, rare earths, aluminum, lithium, and so forth. Or at the other end, downstream at waste, electronic waste, waste sent to incineration, or waste sent to landfills. And what I really like about this project is we're kind of innovating in 3 different ways. Conceptually, we've teamed up with our colleagues at Virginia Tech, Kara Daggett, Shannon Bell, Christine Lubuski, who are looking at feminist, indigenous, anti-racist, and other notions of pluralistic justice. So it isn't just Western's notions of justice rooted in distribution or procedure. We're really trying to understand justice from a subaltern perspective. And what might that mean? Is it synonymous with feminist justice, or are there different things we can borrow and learn from notions of care or different types of ethics? We will then collect empirical data, and actually we're more than halfway done with collecting empirical data. The Boston University team is leading the solar energy cases, and our team at University of Delaware, Lindsay Naylor and Jeremy Firestone, are leading the wind energy cases. And you can see this is an 8-case study. So we are literally sending researchers into all 8 of these cases, where we will do 3 forms of data collection: community interviews, expert interviews, and community focus groups. And you can see our cases are the Kennecott mine in Utah, which is where a lot of the minerals come into the solar supply chain, a manufacturing facility that we just got back from outside of Toledo, Ohio, near Detroit, Michigan, actually. We've already completed research in Riverside, California, where you see a lot of use on the Colorado River Indian Tribes Reservation, as well as in the kind of rural spaces of Southeast California. And finally, we're going to get into electronic waste flows, which end up in very pernicious places, including prisons. And you can see our colleagues at Delaware are doing similarly multi-scalar work, talking about a rare earths mine in Texas, a blade facility in Iowa, disruption of commercial fishers in the Northeast, although I think they're going to change that to the Columbia River Gorge, and finally, recycling and end of life for wind turbine graveyards. The final thing we're going to do once we document these lived experiences, community vulnerabilities, and coping patterns is also then move to identify leverage points to change policy. We are not saying we want you to abandon wind and solar. We are saying that we need to do wind and solar interventions that are more equitable and that minimize their injustices as much as possible. And that's where we'll be having expert elicitation workshops to kind of present some of our findings and help tailor policy recommendations for both wind and solar, as well as for national energy policy. And to kind of give you a sense to humanize some of these cases, we've done 3 of the 4 already on the Boston side. And this shows you a photograph that we've taken of the Kennecott mine near Salt Lake City, Utah. It is apparently the largest hole in the world. We've heard that from multiple respondents. You can see it from outer space. You can see those little specks in the end are actually really large dump trucks. And again, this is making copper and tellurium as well as other types of minerals that do make it directly into the solar supply chain. And there are all sorts of both pros and cons with having mines like this: jobs, water use, dust, resilience, and so forth. And so it's been quite opening to talk to Rio Tinto and to get the community's perspectives all around the mining sites, as well as some of the workers at the mine, to see what they think. Also about the future of mining, which is a lot more mechanization. And Rio Tinto, to their credit, is trying to decarbonize their mine, right? So this also gets into like, what is the future of mining? And can we have electric diggers and electric shovels and electric copperton processors and so forth? And how much can you actually substitute out of fossil fuels? Because these are mostly diesel-powered trucks. This shows you an aerial view of the first solar manufacturing plant in Perrysburg, and those homes are actually quite big. So this really gives you a sense for the scale of these factories. That is one of 5 of these assembly facilities all around Perrysburg, Ohio, where again, we're actually looking at some of the pros and cons of what happens when you create these massive factories, usually in areas of the United States that have been left behind. This is in Toledo because it used to be the glass city, and also it's near Detroit where you've lost a lot of automotive manufacturing. And so it's kind of a reindustrialization of the Midwest and the Northeast. But we're doing things like we got up into a Cessna airplane. That's me on the right flying it. I'm not a licensed pilot, but the pilot let me take over. But you can see here, this is actually the single glass facility that makes high level glass that goes into the first solar supply chain. It's in the bottom of this photo. Right above it is the natural gas and oil-fired power plant that provides its energy. So again, you start to see some sobering linkages between fossil fuels that enter into the solar supply chain. I also have a photograph of a crude oil pipeline going into the first solar plant because they do use some of those hydrocarbons for the manufacturing process. We also talked about displacement of people in California. This is a photo of Desert Center that we took, and you can see those patches of black are not clouds. Every one of those patches of black is a large-scale solar array. There are more than 2 billion solar panels in Riverside County, or more than 4 gigawatts of capacity. That's 4 nuclear power plants worth of solar capacity. And it makes a lot of sense because the solar energy is feeding into California's RPS, and California really is taking net zero seriously, which means they're pushing solar infrastructure into desert communities. And unfortunately, a lot of these desert communities do not want solar near them, or they misunderstand the benefits of solar, or the solar doesn't go to them. solar electricity gets evacuated to San Diego and Los Angeles, leaving these communities to kind of deal with the legacy of solar extraction. And my colleague Alexander Dunlap calls this solar extractivism, where we're reproducing solar infrastructures in the same centralized way that we've done in the past for fossil fuel. And finally, the case that we have yet to do is a shocking one. We're tracking waste flows from solar, which end up in a mix of waste facilities and U.S. prisons. Turns out there's large electronic waste recycling facilities in many federal penitentiaries. They don't always take the solar panels directly, but they will take the gold, the copper, the tellurium, the circuit boards, and a lot of the batteries that are connected to solar systems get disassembled by inmates, by federal prison industries, because it's cheap forms of labor. So this is where anti-racist justice comes in, and where we see a lot of the hazards of e-waste disassembly not only falling people of color, but incarcerated people of color, which opens up some very interesting justice frontiers. And so this is just a kind of taste of the really nice multi-scalar, multi-dimensional, intersectional justice work that we're doing right now, funded by the Sloan Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Those are very tough and very interesting questions. All right, next up, Jonathan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Economics there. I also am the director of the Environmental Inequality Lab, which is a nonpartisan research group focused on understanding and documenting the extent, causes, and consequences of environmental inequality broadly defined in the United States. And so this is the work I'm going to talk to you about today is work that was generously sponsored by the Sloan Foundation, which we're appreciative, very appreciative of. And this is part of a sort of a 2-year program that we've been doing for them, which is coming to an end now, and one of the projects that we've produced. And the goal of this project was really to understand sort of the distributional consequences of the clean energy transition so far, in terms of the labor market aspects of things, in terms of jobs and who gets jobs and what those jobs look like and so on and so forth. And so this is just one aspect of the work that we do at the Environmental Inequality Lab. We also do work in a number of domains, thinking about not just the clean energy transition, but thinking about climate justice and climate change more broadly, as well as sort of more traditional areas of environmental justice, thinking about exposure to air pollution and other forms of environmental hazards and the extent to which those are distributed unevenly, but in a way which is a little different. This is a joint partnership with the US Census Bureau, and the approach that we take is very much a data-driven approach, trying to provide comprehensive and systematic evidence on these topics. And so really, the context that we're thinking about here, we talked about energy access. This is really about access to jobs, more so than in thinking about energy insecurity or energy access. And the backdrop that we're thinking about here is really the decarbonization process in the United States and the economic transition which is implied by that process, right? We have businesses and jobs in legacy fossil fuel industries which will exit, and new clean energy businesses and jobs that will enter and become available. And against the sort of backdrop of rising inequality in the United States, there's a real question as to sort of what the consequences of this clean energy transition will be for not only workers in clean jobs, but also in sort of legacy activities, and the extent to which this will have implications for sort of broader patterns of inequality and opportunity in the United States. And the consequences will really depend on the quality of the jobs and the number of jobs of new jobs that become available, who has access to those jobs, and what happens to workers in legacy sectors who are being displaced. And so the extent to which we can answer these questions is really one of measurement. And ultimately, as in all things, we're constrained by what we can measure. But we're very fortunate to be in a position, and this is what the Sloan Foundation really sponsored us to do, is to be measuring things much more comprehensively at the individual level. So existing work and existing research in this space, and this is true of a lot of work in environmental inequality, tends to use data about locations. We talk about, places and communities, but ultimately we care about people. And that's sort of been very difficult to get towards because existing work has either tended to use, as I said, place-based aggregate data, or tended to use sort of very selected samples of workers in the context of the clean energy transition, or smaller samples of individuals for particular locations in sort of the environmental inequality work more broadly. And so the Sloan Foundation sponsored us to basically create a new data infrastructure. As I said, this is a partnership with the US Census Bureau. And so we're drawing on a lot of administrative data sources, from IRS tax returns to the Census Bureau administrative data and survey data. And what we've basically done is to construct sort of an individual level employer-employee data set, which has national coverage for everyone in the United States with a social security number. So all permanent citizens, all citizens and permanent residents over sort of a 20+ year period. And so this allows us to track individuals over time and space. We've rationalized or reconciled information on people down to the address level, so we can see not only where they work, but where they live. And so when they move location, we can track people. And when they move jobs, we can track those considerations as well. And so, many of you will be in, the vast majority of you will be in the data. If you have a social security number, you're in the data set. And so, the way to sort of think about this data set is everyone, think of your jobs in your history of work over sort of the 2005 to 2022 period. And when you switch jobs, that sort of is a change. And what we're going to do in this project really is consider people who have ever had any sort of employment history within either a legacy energy activity or a new clean activity. And so that also includes the times when those individuals are not working in the energy industry at all, but we can sort of see their full sort of employment histories over time and space. And so using this data, this is the project today, which is joint work with Eva Lubitsch and John Voorhees, colleagues at the US Census Bureau. We're going to use this data just to sort of, I thought it would be interesting to sort of just give you some facts that have come out of this work. And so the data that we're using provides new insights into sort of aggregate patterns and trends, information on earnings and job spells for workers in both clean and legacy activities, information on the extent to which workers have historically moved from and to between legacy and clean jobs, and as well as information as to what's happening to workers in legacy sectors. So just to start with the aggregate trends, what we see. So this is bottom up. We just aggregated the data from the individual level to sort of the country as a whole. In terms of growth of establishments, we see that there's been a huge growth in the number of sort of clean establishments, from about 1.2 thousand establishments back in 2005 to nearly 4,000 establishments. 2019, we've got this updated now to later years, but this is the most recent disclosed information. And then for legacy activities, less growth. In fact, a slight decline relative to 2005. There's now sort of 41,000 establishments compared to 41,500 establishments in 2019. So there's just there's been much faster growth, but there's obviously a very large level difference between the number of clean establishments and legacy establishments. If we look at employment growth in clean and legacy activities, we see there's been, again, very large growth in the number of clean activities, from around about 79,000 employees to 143,000 employees in 2019. And in the clean activities, and in legacy activities, that has not declined, that has grown. And this is a broad definition of fossil fuel activities, but from 926,000 to 1.2 million in 2019. And again, just so there's been growth in both, much faster growth in the clean activity, but off a much lower baseline. And so that's sort of an important distinction to see here, that there's still a very large level gap in terms of employment in clean versus legacy activities. So who works at these establishments? So here we have sort of three definitions. We have the clean activities, the legacy activities, and then when, neither. So this is for the same set of individuals, over their employment histories over time, sort of thinking about what are the characteristics of individuals in this space. So, we see that workers in clean and legacy activities are, disproportionately white relative to sort of workers in who aren't working in the energy activities. They're far less likely to be Black or non-Hispanic Black compared to the sort of labor force as a whole. And in Hispanic individuals, the Hispanic individuals are less likely to be working in clean activities as well over this period, although that trend is positive and upwards for both Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black individuals relative to non-Hispanic white individuals. So these shares are about sort of 10 to 11% employment in terms of the economy as a whole, compared to sort of 6% for non-Hispanic Black, and again, sort of 5 to sort of 10% over the time period for clean activities for Hispanic individuals, compared to sort of 12 to 15% for the economy as a whole, and a disproportionate number of Hispanic individuals working in legacy activities. Relative to the economy as a whole, clean and legacy established activities tend to be disproportionately male in terms of the share of employees, and in terms of education levels. When we look at the economy as a whole or in clean activities, there's very similar participation of college educated individuals compared to legacy activities. And so this sort of tells us something about potential mismatch in terms of the opportunities for workers in legacy sectors in terms of opportunities in clean activities. In terms of the types of jobs or the quality of the jobs, we see that transitions out of clean or legacy employment are costly. So when workers move between clean and legacy activities, so for example, moving in between a sort of a legacy activity into a clean activity, earnings basically stay very similar. And similarly, if there's movement back and forth between clean and legacy activities, these earnings are much higher. For the workers that do move back and forth, they on average are earning a lot more. But when you move either out of clean activities or legacy activities into sort of non-energy activities, there are substantial earnings losses. And similarly, when you move out of non-energy activities into energy activities, there are substantial earnings gains. And so this suggests that these transitions are costly. In terms of the likelihood of transitioning, we see that workers who previously held employment in legacy activities, there's a very, very, very small green band here, are incredibly unlikely to move into clean activities. We can look at this either from the previous job or the current job's perspective. There's not much of a difference, right? If we look at people who are currently working in clean activities, there's a little bit more of a band of orange down here, but disproportionately, the likelihood of moving from a legacy activity into a clean activity is very rare. In terms of the likelihood of transitioning, or
Jonathan, if you can wrap up
yes, I'm
quickly.
just finishing just the
Okay,
final
great.
slides. Yes. So in terms of who moves, we see that for moving from legacy to clean, the people who move are disproportionately white and college educated, and less likely to be Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black. And this differs from sort of any move within the economy. And so just sort of taking stock, what we find in this sort of activity so far is that clean energy jobs are high wage jobs, but not necessarily more so than legacy jobs. That transitions between legacy and clean jobs are incredibly rare. And when they do occur, earnings remain similar. But the sort of the cost of moving out of the energy sector or failing to get into the clean energy activities is substantial. And so this, taken together, suggests that that there could be quite a large potential for transitional costs as the clean transition proceeds. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, and we look forward to delving more into during the Q&A. Again, a reminder for the audience, there's a Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions, and we will get to that at the end of the webinar. Next, it is Diana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for setting this up. Always a pleasure. And also thank you very much to the Sloan Foundation. This work is really in support of New York City-based research efforts. This is kind of a specific charge that the Sloan Foundation has, and it links really well with my own not only work but emphasis on doing locally meaningful work. At the Energy Equity Housing and Health Program at the Mailman School of Public Health, we focus on issues at this kind of critical intersection, looking at both questions of energy insecurity, energy and climate justice, but also making sure that it's actionable and that we have paths forward in partnership and collaboration. So I'm really grateful to do that. This is part of a larger study, though I will only be presenting on work that has been published, and this paper was just published in the Health Affairs Journal just a few weeks ago or months ago at this point. And it's on this concept of energy insecurity that some of you know. I recognize that other people are have been working in this space and in adjacent areas. But this particular project is really building on both the conceptual work and work on the measurement of energy insecurity, both defined as the inability to meet household energy needs and kind of reflective of physical, economic, and coping dimensions, kind of appreciating the multidimensionality of it, but also really importantly thinking about it as a public health concern. So this project was done with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And it's the first representative survey of New York City residents to explore how the prevalence and the kind of health correlates of energy insecurity here in the city. And we did this project in 2022, really to understand the kind of mechanisms that reflect the unfolding of energy insecurity for New York City residents, and just kind of as background for why that's important, the kind of building landscape is unique in New York City in that a lot of buildings here are multifamily, that it's very possible, really kind of in distinguishing between households that, for instance, pay their own utilities and where either all of the utilities or the heat alone are provided by the landlord. So there's this either cost sharing or where the cost component isn't necessarily a factor. And what we know about the kind of social distribution and patterning of neighborhoods and communities, so that you have kind of concentration of privilege and disadvantage by census tract and zip code in really stark ways. So the inequalities are pretty deep, even within the city boundaries. Um, this work does, I always like to say, like, what's the gift of a paper? This paper has several gifts. One is really on the refinement of the kind of measuring energy insecurity as an experiential hardship. Is really moving away from a simplified measure and really taking into account that though there are multiple ways that this phenomenon is experienced, and we landed on kind of 10 indicators. And I think we were very cautious in this paper to, like, put forward these indicators, noting that, there's still work to be done, but that this is kind of a very good start. So those indicators are the home is too cold, it's too hot, you have difficulty paying the bill, you have utility debt, there's a disconnection notice or a shut off, there's no air conditioning because of run costs, so there's an economic conditioning on the use of an air conditioning or whether or not even people have it. And likewise with heat, using a stove or oven for heat and reducing energy use because of costs. And when we look at the distribution of these energy insecurity measures, what you really see is that the majority of households are actually reducing energy because of cost. And on the one hand, you could look at this indicator and say, that's great, you know, folks are reducing energy and we want people to conserve. However, this also introduces health risks if people are foregoing the use of energy use in a way that, you know, essentially can compromise health. And then, of course, the use of a stove or oven for heat would kind of be secondary to that. And then difficulty paying the bill. But we also found that many households are reporting their homes being too hot or too cold. We looked further into this and basically defined energy insecurity in this sample as households experiencing 3 or more of these indicators. So, you know, it's one thing to look at this phenomenon as a singular outcome, like whether or not people were disconnected from their utility services. First of all, we know that so few households, both in New York City and nationally, experience utility shutoff. So that as a metric is kind of incomplete. And there are precursors to disconnections. Moreover, it's very common that these are cumulative burdens, so that people are actually experiencing more than one of these indicators at once, and that's what we wanted to be able to measure in this sample. So with, you know, kind of thinking about this more cumulative definition and assignment of households into energy insecurity by virtue of having 3 or more of them, we have a prevalence rate of 28% of adult New Yorkers having experienced energy insecurity, and many of the usual suspects of inequality surface around race, around renter-owner status, recent immigrants versus those living in the United States for longer periods of time, and then households with children versus those with no children. So in some ways, this is kind of confirmatory of prior work. One of the areas that is kind of novel about this is also about its links to health. So what we found in controlling for race, ethnicity, income, etc., is that households experiencing 3 or more indicators of energy insecurity were more likely to also experience a mental health condition, 2 times, so the adjusted odds of 2.2 for a respiratory condition, an adjusted odds of 2.5 for cardiovascular conditions and 3.4 for medical device use. All of these really showing that health is clearly linked, and it's not always necessarily an outcome. Of course, this is not causal analysis, but we are able to really kind of firmly show that households that are experiencing cumulative indicators are more likely to also experience these kind of chronic health conditions or be really reliant on electric medical devices to sustain their health and life. One of the pieces of this work that is already in the public domain has to do with our social media work. So given climate change and the fact that, I just want to make sure that I'm good on time. Sorry. So given climate change and the fact that households are, we meant to be doing some home-based work last winter, but it turned out to be a really warm winter, and we weren't able to kind of do our planned work in homes. And what we did instead was just take some of these questions to the street. And we now have an account called Hot and Cold NYC that's been pretty successful in both like situating, grounding, and humanizing this experience, and really kind of showcasing what kind of regular New Yorkers on
What does
the
it feel like to get your Con Ed bill? Oh my God.
300. There's like probably 5 of us and arguments all the time behind it.
I kind of helped my friend with that, and it was just the most difficult thing.
Blamed each other, so we never really, that's why I had to get out of there.
We don't understand how it gets that high. Her bill right now is probably like, oh my God, like $300 and something.
So there's more there, but basically we wanted to be able to showcase that. And then I'm going to keep going. So basically the take homes are around. So Benjamin talked about doing work that's policy relevant. And, this work is really situated in within the confines of a city. So working with a city agency, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, really thinking about the ways in which this data serves their own purposes as a local agency, but also, they have a bigger vision for what this will ultimately look like. And so offering subject matter expertise, collaborating on the development of the survey tool, kind of also innovating on the indicators, all of these and really establishing and demonstrating the links to health are really the kind of anchoring for this work and for its translation very importantly. And so there's still work to be done. I think that there's a lot of this work is kind of serving as a baseline for ultimately being able to showcase changes over time in this space. And so with that, I'll just end and say please read, cite, and follow us. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Diana. And last but not least, we have John Binder.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and really appreciate being here amongst, I guess, the single government interloper amongst the distinguished group of academics and researchers. So thanks very much. I'm just gonna try to get my screen sharing working. It was working before, of course. Let's see. All right. So I want to briefly talk about our state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and specifically our New York Cap and Invest program that we call NICI, and maybe reference a little bit how all the items that the panelists discussed could help us in terms of making some decisions as we implement and design this program. So I'm going to start at just really sort of the high level of what our law requires us to do in New York. That's really the 85% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2050 from 1990 levels, and 40% by 2030, again from 1990 levels, along with a bunch of energy generation and renewable energy commitments. But I think for purposes of today, the critical thing are the requirements for climate justice, recognizing the longstanding environmental injustice that we have seen in a variety of communities across the state. So what are those requirements? Because really, it's important to recognize that our state's climate law really has woven in a bunch of different requirements related to equity and disadvantaged communities that are central to all of the various policy choices that we are making as part of implementing the Climate Act. So first, as many folks might know, the Climate Act created the Climate Justice Working Group, and that group finalized criteria to identify disadvantaged communities. That was based on over 40 indicators related to various types of environmental and climate change related burdens and risks, along with different socioeconomic characteristics, many of which the panelists spoke to in various contexts.
John, quickly, I'm
so
going to
those
interrupt. If you can
yeah.
hit the slide from the beginning, we can see the slide presentation right now. We don't see it on full screen.
How about now? Not working properly?
It is not working.
Sure, what's going on? Sorry about that. Bear with me. I'm not sure why that's. Any better?
It is still the same, but maybe you can make it bigger if we can troubleshoot, and that could work. Great.
Sorry about that. So yeah, these requirements have been, like I said, woven into the requirements of the Climate Act in terms of addressing requirements related to disadvantaged communities. So we now have census tracts that have been identified as disadvantaged communities across the state based on these indicators. And so there's a bunch of different requirements that are relevant to us. That includes making sure that everything that we do under the Climate Act and the actions that we take under the law do not result in a net increase in pollutants or otherwise disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. That's also relevant to all of the various decisions that we make as agencies across the state. In the permitting context, for example, we're also required to prioritize reductions of greenhouse gas and co-pollutant emissions in disadvantaged communities. And then just like the Justice 40 requirements that were referenced earlier, we have to make sure that at least 35%, but really with a goal of 40% or more of all of our investments directly benefit disadvantaged communities. So I'm not going to spend much time here, but just showing the greenhouse gas reduction requirements that we have to make under the climate law. We have made some progress over the course of the last 30 years since 1990, but we need to make a lot more progress to get to our 40 by 30 and 85 by 50 emission reduction requirements. And in terms of the cap and invest program, really our charge at DEC, along with our colleagues at NYSERDA, is to develop a cap and invest program that helps to advance both those greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, as well as the equity and disadvantaged community related requirements that are built right into the law. So we're trying to do both of these in the context of this program. The idea is for the cap. Yep.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt again.
ahead.
I don't think your slides are
Okay.
moving. So you might have
Wow.
to just
Okay.
manually
Really?
scroll down on that screen.
I'm not sure
There we
what's
go.
happening here. My
Now it is
apologies.
working.
Sorry. So really our goal here is to make sure that the program is, the NICI program is working in conjunction with a variety of other policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and do it in an affordable manner. Because again, as we heard from many other panelists, energy burden and affordability of energy is going to be a critical piece of our success in equitably transitioning our overall economy. So just briefly, I think maybe a lot of folks are familiar with how cap and invest programs work, but the key parts to understand here are the cap, so that's the actual limit on the annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we emit every year. That's the cap portion of the program. And then the invest portion, which is where I think a lot of these conversations we're having today are going to be most relevant, is where we are generating proceeds through the auction of emission allowances, and we're investing proceeds back through a variety of means, both to transition the economy to be that decarbonized economy, but also to address affordability and equity principles. So I want to speak briefly about the use of NICI proceeds. We know very broadly where the money that's going to be coming in from this program is going to go. We have three basically pots of money that have been defined by our legislature. And that includes 30% that's going to go through this Consumer Climate Action Account directly back to New Yorkers. Again, recognizing that energy burden that is felt by particularly low and moderate income households. So proceeds will be going directly back to individuals to help mitigate consumer costs from the program. And then really that leaves the rest, about 2/3, that go to helping this broader transition to a clean energy economy. And really, the investment of these proceeds is really critical to advancing our equity objectives. By 2030, we are expecting that this program will be generating between $6 and $12 billion per year just for New York State, and that'll be after we distribute about a third of that back to consumers for affordability, that'll still leave $4 to $8 billion available for investments. And we know that through targeting, using some of the methods and that were described by the previous panelists, we can target some of those investments in ways that can really help to reduce pollution and advance equitable outcomes within disadvantaged communities. We also have, by the way, an ongoing statewide community air monitoring initiative that is another opportunity that we have to target these investments. So the 1/3 of funds that will be used to address affordability is really going to be designed in a way that is progressive, meaning that we want the benefit to go towards low-income New Yorkers the most, recognizing that those households do have the highest energy burdens. And our thought here is that disbursement of these proceeds can be really done in a way to minimize that energy burden based on income level and other factors. And so a lot of the research that we heard the panelists talk about, I think, can help to inform some of these choices. Just to briefly highlight what we expect to see out of the NICI program, pursuant to some of the modeling and analyses that has taken place so far. So far, we are not projecting any net increase in pollution as a result of this of NICI within disadvantaged communities. We actually are expecting a greater share of emission reductions in air quality and health-related benefits within those communities relative to areas of the state outside of disadvantaged communities. We are projecting reduced emissions across the state, but even greater benefits in terms of health within disadvantaged communities. Of course, we recognize that some of that is due to the, higher baseline rates that we see in a variety of health indicators within disadvantaged communities, which just drives home the point of why we're needing to do this in the first place. And so this is an illustration of some of that. By 2035, we are projecting health and air quality improvements to provide a variety of benefits as a result of the NICI program across the state, but even more so within disadvantaged communities in terms of relevant to sort of the share of the population. So, and this is another, if we're talking about projected health benefits from a financial value perspective, about 45% of the benefits are going to be health benefits within disadvantaged communities, relative to about 36% of the population of the state that are within disadvantaged communities. So our hope is that in some small way, this will help to advance and correct for this longstanding injustice that we see in a variety of ways across the state. So when we're talking about disadvantaged community considerations within the NICI program, again, that's New York Capital Invest, there's a few different things that we are thinking about. I've been talking about the right-hand column, which are ways that we can target investments to help health and environmental outcomes in disadvantaged communities. So that includes, $4 to $8 billion per year that can be targeted in a variety of ways to help this broader transition to a carbon-intensive economy, less carbon-intensive economy, of course, right? That can be targeted through investments that are focused on emissions reductions in disadvantaged communities. There's some of the labor-related issues that were discussed earlier, all with that 35% requirement and 40% goal. There's also the affordability benefit that I talked about, that consumers are getting benefits back to help address the energy burdens that households feel. But then, in addition to those, we have a variety of complementary policies to address air pollution in disadvantaged communities. And then we are not going to be allowing offsets in disadvantaged communities. So just to quickly wrap up, and I do apologize about some of the technical difficulties there. We are advancing this program throughout the course of this year. We have been getting a lot of input on the design of the program, and we've continued to welcome input, including from the researchers that are here today in terms of some of these choices that we have before us. We will soon be launching an investment planning process, which is where I think a lot of this input will really be most helpful to help to target the portfolio of investments that we are designing, with the goal of launching the program beginning next year. The last couple of slides are just places that you can find additional material about the Cap and Invest program and the Climate Act overall in terms of our broader implementation. So with that, thank you very much. Appreciate being here today.
Thank you so much, John, and I invite all the other panelists to turn on their cameras for the Q&A. So I'm going to start with the reverse order John, we heard a lot from our researchers about different dimensions that they're looking at in the energy transition, different metrics, and Diana had a lot of different indicators. So I'm curious, how are you at you meaning DC and the state are tracking progress, and what kind of metrics you're looking at beyond the air quality issues you already showed the slide about?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, obviously, as the environmental regulator at DEC, air emissions is one of our key metrics, whether that's greenhouse gas pollution or coal pollutant emissions. So we are continuing to track those metrics, both sort of statewide, but also within disadvantaged communities. And the key thing there is that community air monitoring initiative that I mentioned. But in addition to that, I think we're obviously very concerned about some of the things that were being discussed, I think, by Dr. Hernandez, right, in terms of energy affordability for households. That's something that we recognize is a concern from the perspective of those households, but also from the perspective of our ability to achieve these overall state policies. So those are metrics that we're very much concerned with as well. And then some of the supply chain concerns that were discussed as well is something that we're very much focused on, because we want to make sure that we are achieving those offshore wind and other renewable energy policy requirements, but doing it in a way that doesn't have undue impacts from other environmental perspectives beyond climate change. So there's a lot more there, but that's just some initial thoughts.
Yeah. Great. So I'm going to turn to our researcher panelists for a similar question. I heard all of you talk about different dimensions of metrics, and some of them are, non-traditional indicators. Diana, I thought it was fascinating to have this indicator about stove, people using stove for their heat, for example. I don't think it would have ever occurred to a, ex ante to look at some of these indicators. So I'm curious, what are some interesting findings about these metrics as you think about developing these metrics, and where you see bigger gaps in terms of measuring these metrics and energy transition. Diana, maybe I will start with you and then move counterclockwise on my screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the measurement issue is so substantial, right? I mean, I think one of the in terms of the evolution of this work, some of it has been conceptual, some of it has been really rooted in more qualitative work. But when you think about scale, and when you think about understanding the impact of huge policy initiatives, you have to be able to think about not just the number of metrics, but also zeroing in on what really captures the essence of something. And I think, we offer 10 metrics and then measured it by having 3 or more. In some ways, like, a more beneficial thing is just to have 1 good or 2 good or 3, but also minimize and be more parsimonious. But it's really necessary because there are so many different stakeholders that are being held to account in terms of moving the dial, but they want to be able to, and they need to be able to also demonstrate not just baseline, but improvements over time, or in some cases where there are negative impacts, right? I mean, we have to be able to appreciate that the metrics component of this is what allows us to track progress one way or the other.
Anissa?
Yeah, so the metrics that are related to our project, the Energy Equity Research Network project, we have seven metrics, but they are primarily tied to recruitment of participants and progress toward the 210 homes that we're planning on adding to our research network. So in partnership with all the universities that I mentioned, all the community-based organizations, we have metrics related to the different regions and locations, and then a certain number of homes that we're trying to recruit, having all of those agreements signed with participants, homes scheduled, then the next step for installations. A lot of those installations are pending because we're still in early days of the project. And then the last piece is the home installs that are completed. So a lot of our metrics are around the successful recruitment of participants for this, and then the installations that are underway in each of the 4 regions that I described. So those are the most important metrics for our project right now.
Great. Benjamin?
Yeah, in our Sloan project, we're kind of just using very qualitative lived experiences data, so we're not actually measuring metrics like we will for the Department of Energy project. But I did want to bring attention to a recent review that I thought was pretty well done, led by Aaron Baker, as well as colleagues like Destiny Knock and David Kaninsky, where they talked about metrics for decision making in energy justice, which is very relevant to today. And they kind of found in this huge review 5 different types of metrics. So the question is like, what are you measuring? One of which are tenets of equity and justice, and they said there it's mostly distributional impacts. We need to get better at recognitional and procedural impacts. There are spatial and temporal metrics like family, community, etc. There are sectoral impacts like electricity impacts, transportation impacts, industry impacts. And then there's kind of what Diana presented, which is like impacts on people. What is the energy burden? What are shutoffs? What's wealth creation? What's local air pollution? What's kind of access and reliability metrics? And then finally, and this is what we try to really capture in our Sloan grant, are the life cycle impacts, which again are usually invisible, and that's all the way upstream or downstream. So I kind of like that, in that intersectionality isn't just about types of impacts on people, it's actually intersections among those different 5 dimensions of justice and equity.
Thank you, Benjamin. Jonathan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think in all of this, especially in our work, we are more constrained in terms of the depth of metrics that we can get at, like Diana and other people's works, where you're on the ground with people, able to ask them what's going on. I think where we sort of are able to do a little bit more, and this is where the complementarity of different approaches is essential, is to get sort of a more comprehensive and systematic and aggregate understanding of things, which is so essential when it comes to understanding disparities, because of course, if you're only focusing on one particular sample of a community, then that may not be representative of the whole. And so being able to sort of say, not just at the US level, but breaking things out by states and different communities, but wholly, which is what the data affords us to be able to do, is kind of sets the scene, at least, to then facilitate or shine a light where researchers that engage in more qualitative approaches or sort of case study oriented in-depth analysis of quantitative data, it sort of shines a light on where to sort of focus and provides context and framing for that type of analysis. So I think, yeah, it's important to go deep, but also to get sort of a broad understanding as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for those answers. We have multiple questions at the Q&A. Some of them are specific to a panelist. I'm going to start with the broader question. From your perspective, I think this is for everybody. From your perspective, what are the most significant gaps in knowledge around energy inequity that future studies should aim to better understand? On this, maybe I will ask John first, as a person who's working to implement a law that is, hopefully lead to more equitable outcomes. Where are some gaps in studies, and where, like, you're thinking, oh, I wish there was some research on this particular energy equity issue?
Well, some of the panelists today were addressing some of them, so I appreciated that. I think so that going into this, I maybe thought there was more than I heard after I heard today, so I appreciate that. Otherwise, I think it's just the connection between what you all are talking about and some of our decision making. So how do we sort of take and translate the measurable tools that you all are talking about and inform policymakers and regulators, such as myself, in a way that we can sort of digest and then translate back to community stakeholders. So it's really sort of this dialogue between what works with community-based decision-making and using research to help inform that. So I think that's sort of the intersection that I think would be most helpful from my perspective if there's more assistance there.
Great, thank you. I'm going the reverse order, so Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, just at a high level, for me, the most interesting sort of questions are trying to understand what the constraints are to either, accessing or opportunities, or, adopting opportunities, and so it's not at all obvious, right? Is it information constraints? Is it credit constraints, or like financing constraints? And so understanding what's stopping people or businesses from being able to take advantage and move forwards with the energy transition is to me where the interesting questions lie.
Definitely. Benjamin.
So I do think that those other parts of the life cycle, upstream and downstream, we're missing a lot of data on, and it's not easy to get a lot of the corporate data. But I think even when you talk about demographic groups, there tends to be two biases in our data. One is we obsess over weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies, which account for 12% of the population, but 87% of research. And secondly, we still tend to focus a lot on homeowners, right? Whereas we're not really focusing on, say, like students or the elderly or the youth or critically indigenous communities. So I think you're already starting to see like sampling biases of like we go to the Census Bureau and get a representative sample, but that's not really a sample of vulnerable groups. And so I would love to see more work on those types of groups. Same with the homeless, same with refugees, asylum seekers. There's all sorts of really vulnerable groups that we don't even know much about.
Thank you, Benjamin. Anissa?
Yeah, I think one thing that we have observed in our research and through the collection of the data in our data port at Pecan Street is that, and this aligns to a lot of the research that we've read that others have written as well as other projects from the Sloan Foundation, is there is an energy paradox. So this is the reality that there are a lot of energy efficiency technologies that would pay off for adopters, but they're not adopted. And for a lot of reasons, right? People don't have access to information, they don't have access to incentives that would help them to be motivated to adopt these technologies. And so that to us is the crux of this problem around this energy efficiency gap, is that all of these energy efficient technologies, they would be socially efficient, but they're just not adopted. Like things like charging anxiety. I'm obsessed with reading articles about people who are not EV adopters because they're worried that they can't go on really long road trips if they have an electric vehicle. And why is that? And so people kind of stair step from, gas to hybrid and then to EV. But I think that this broader concept is what we really need to think about in terms of access to information, access to incentives, to resources, and not just giving communities information, but sitting shoulder to shoulder with them and trying to figure out how to navigate all of these rebate programs, all of these incentive programs, out of all of the federal funding that's coming out of the Biden administration. So there is that gap. And I think this is like the crux of the problem, is we have so many technologies, efficiencies, things we know can help to accelerate this clean energy transition, but people just don't adopt for different reasons.
Thank you. That is definitely a big part of the problem, people not knowing. And for the last word, Diana, no pressure.
No, I just want to say everything Anissa said, you are so spot on. And I appreciate the fact that your work is also really rooted in interfacing with communities. And so 10 years ago, when we were having these conversations were about how policy ought to change. And actually, what the CLCPA really shows is that there's been a lot of progress. What Justice 40 really shows is that there's a lot of progress. And that's true not only in the US, but around the world. And yet there are still these really kind of critical gaps. And how do we fill those gaps? How do we understand them? How do we course correct? So when I think about the gaps, I think of it as kind of related to more implementation and translation. So where is the research kind of translating into policies, programs, and other interventions, and how can research serve the purpose of better understanding the impact? So I'm also going to put something in the chat that's related to what Anaisa said. So thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Diana, and thank you to all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we're out of time, even though I have a lot of questions, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation in various, different forums. We have another webinar upcoming in this series on June 6th, so don't forget to sign up for that. Otherwise, please join me in thanking our panelists and also Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for their support of this webinar, as well as all of this amazing research. Have a great afternoon.